it's necessary for you to look at the world through a limited frame of reference. The reason for that is you're not very smart. Your consciousness can only handle about 4 bits of information per second. It's not very much, given that the number of bits of information coming at you from the external world are, for all practical purposes, infinite. You're, like Aldous Huxley suggested, your brain seems to be primarily a reducing agent. Your body's a reducing agent as well, because there are lots of things that you just can't detect. And then the room that you're sitting in is a reducing agent because it's keeping all sorts of things out that you would otherwise have to deal with. And the stability of this city is a reducing agent because we're not going to be stampeded by barbarians with any luck at every moment or any moment. We deal with the complexity of the world in part by inhabiting a sequence of reducing structures until the world is reduced enough so that we can actually deal with the minute elements of it that we can comprehend at any one moment. And those elements we comprehend are not the familiar objects of objective reality. In fact, animals, and people included, aren't much interested in objective reality. We're interested in pragmatic reality. And pragmatic reality is the reality that you act on, not that you perceive. And because we're embedded in bodies, and because we're biological organisms, and because we're concerned with survival and reproduction, among other things, how to act is a much more important question for us than what is the world constituted of. How to act, in some sense, is also the prime Darwinian question, right? Because if you act wrongly from a Darwinian perspective, you end up dead before you can reproduce. So the world that we inhabit, given that we're alive, and given that what selected us to act, is actually a pragmatic world. And the objects of pragmatic worlds aren't objects, they're tools and obstacles. They have value a priori. From the Newtonian perspective, you look at the world, and then you think about the world that you see, the objects of the world that you see, and then you evaluate them, and then you act, and that is not how your brain works. It's just wrong. You might see the value of things before you see the object itself. I mean, there are people, for example, who are blind. They have blind sight. They can recognize emotions on faces without knowing they can see. So, that's partly because their retinas are attached to their amygdala. Your retina is attached to a lot of your body, not just your visual cortex. It's attached to your spinal cord. It's attached to your nervous system at multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. And so you can use your eyes to detect things that you don't know you're seeing. So, and what in some sense, what you often detect under those circumstances is valence, value. So you're very good, for example, at detecting teeth and predatory eyes, and the reasons for that are self-evident, fundamentally. The basic framework is something like this, and you're always looking at the world through this framework, and the framework has, as one pole, where you are and what you're doing, where you are now. So that's point A. You're always trying to get from point A to point B because you're a linear creature and you're embodied, so you're moving. And so, fundamentally, what you're looking at the world through is a sequence of maps, and maps tell you how to get to where you want to go. And so, the map specifies where you are because obviously you can't get anywhere if you don't know where you are, and many people, of course, are confused about where they are, so they don't get anywhere. And you also have to know where you're going. And that's point A and point B, and every time you look at the world, you're looking through a framework that has those two valued points implicit in your cognitive structure. And generally what you think is, where you're going is better than where you are. Because otherwise, why would you go there? Now, some people do choose to go to places that are worse than where they are, but they're a special case. You probably live with some of them. Now, when you're going from point A to point B, fundamentally you have to move. Now, movement is not abstract. Movement is what you do with your body. And so, once your abstract representation transforms itself into action, you're no longer in the realm of abstraction. So in order to get from one place to another, you have to know where you are, and you have to know where you're going, and then you have to perform some sort of embodied action to get there. And of course, you have conscious control over your voluntary muscular system, but underneath that, you don't really have anything at all, right? You can move your arm, you have no idea what muscles you're moving. So your conscious representation of your body grounds out basically at voluntary movement of the larger muscle systems. So Now you might ask, well, what does specify where you're going? And the answer to that, in large part, is biology. But biology in a complex manner. And this is where higher order morality starts to become a concern. You share with other animals various forms of implicit motivation. And, you know, you can kind of lump those. It's arbitrary. I lump them into self-maintenance motivations and self-propagation motivations. You can cut that in different ways. Like I said, it's more conceptual than based on, say, you know, anatomy. But it'll do. Self-maintenance, well, you don't want to get too hot, you don't want to get too cold. Your hypothalamus deals with that, a very old part of the brain. It's way more important than your cortex. You can take the whole cortex off a female cat, and as long as you keep it in a cage, and it has its hypothalamus, it can pretty much behave like a cat, except that it's hyper-exploratory, which is the last thing you'd expect from an animal with no brain. You can't be too hot, you can't be too cold, you got to regulate your water intake, you have to eat, you have to deal with the consequences of eating, you have to be with other people. There's a play circuit, a specialized play circuit, there's a specialized erotic circuit, there's a specialized circuit for exploration, which is about half of what the hypothalamus does, by the way. And those systems, they've often been conceptualized as drives, but they're not really that. They're more like isolated, one-eyed personalities. They're like cyclops. They want one thing. Now, they're not stupid, but they're not very amenable to argument. So when you're hungry, and, you know, another motivational system might object to that, and that happens frequently, which is partly why people are often confused, and also why you need a cortex, because, you know, you need a cortex to allow the competing motivational systems to array themselves properly and harmoniously across time so that they all get their due, instead of fighting like 2-year-olds in a room, because 2-year-olds are basically hypothalamic, you know, and so they're lots of fun, but they're not organized and they're not social at all. So what happens with the motivational systems very deep in your brain is they specify the value of where you are, so that one of the values might be, I'm thirsty. And then they tune your perception so that things that are associated with the quenching of thirst are much more likely to be picked up by your perceptual system. And they bias your perceptual processing and your valuation towards improvement of that motivational lack. And so you can't really think of them as drives, because they're way more complicated than that. They specify where you are, so there's an element of self-consciousness that's associated with that. I'm thirsty. And they specify a target, usually using fantasy. You know, you get thirsty, you think, well, what would I like to drink? And you get a little fantasy about maybe a glass of juice or a bit of water or something like that. And then your nervous system is tuned, and then you walk into the kitchen and you ignore everything that's irrelevant to the search for liquid, and you focus in on everything that's relevant to the search for liquid, and that means you're so blind you cannot believe it. I mean, there's been many experiments now that have shown that you can do things like, I'm sure some of you have seen this, you can introduce a gorilla into a basketball game, and 60 or 70% of the people watching, as long as they're paying attention to the ball, they won't see the gorilla. And it's not like a little tiny gorilla that's somewhere off in the corner. It's like main center, 6 feet high, beating its chest. And even when you know that, if something else changes in the background, you won't see that either. So as far as you guys know, the carpet could be changing colors 15, 20 times a minute. You wouldn't even notice it, unless you had some weird obsession with carpets. So, okay, so that's the beginning, in some sense, of a universal system of values, right? And I can tell you how universal this is. I always have to tell this story because it's so damn funny. I just can't believe it. So, one of the things that your brain is very concerned with is relative status. That's wired in, by the way, which is partly why relative poverty is often such a social problem. People hate being low in status, especially men. Well, the male status hierarchy is a bit different than women, and women are pretty sensitive to status too, but they use different markers. Anyways, part of what happens when your status goes up is that your brain serotonin levels go up, and when your brain serotonin levels go up, you're less irritable and you experience less negative emotion per unit of uncertainty or threat. And so when you demean someone and you interfere with, and you lower their presumed status as far as a very primordial circuit is concerned, you alter the system that regulates their emotions. And they hate that. People hate that more than anything. And it's an unbelievably archaic circuit. You can kind of tell this because depressed people basically act like they're low status, and depressed people are depressed about everything. Now, it's not easy to be depressed about everything, right? And so the fact that that's the case means that what's ever gone astray has to be very primordial because it affects everything. Anyways, people often use antidepressants to cure depression, hence their name. And antidepressants decrease the rate at which serotonin is taken back up by the neurons that produce it. Well, 300 million years ago, crustaceans emerged. And crustaceans live in dominance hierarchies, even though they're not particularly social. And if one lobster fights with another and gets defeated, then he won't fight with another lobster even when he beat for 20 minutes, unless you give him antidepressants, in which case he'll fight again right away. And the reason I'm telling you this is because the status structure that underlies your being, not just your brain, but your being, is so old you share it with crustaceans. So you mess with it at your peril. It's not learned, by no means. So anyways, you wander around inside one of these little frames, going from point A to point B all the time. And one of the annoying things about life, and this is sort of the Sisyphus story, is that as soon as you climb from point A to point B, and you get there, then there's another point A and another point B. And that's kind of interesting too, because one of the things it suggests is that getting somewhere isn't really what people want, because as soon as you get somewhere, then you're done going there, and then you have to get somewhere else. So in some sense, it seems it's an accomplishment. In another sense, it's just the next rock up the mountain. Now, you all know this because, you graduated from university, and that was a good day, but the next day, you weren't a university student, you were some unemployed loser. And that's that sets up a whole new set of problems, right? I mean, that's how the frame shifts. And when the frame shifts like that, then the value of everything shifts around it. So, it turns out that people are actually more interested in getting from point A to point B than they are in actually being at point B. And almost all of the positive emotion that you feel, which is related to dopaminergic circuitry, by the way, you experience in relationship to the pursuit of a valued goal rather than to the attainment of the goal. The attainment of the goal actually satisfies you, or more specifically, it satisfies that motivational circuit, but then the damn thing just shuts off and another one starts yelling at you. So it's like a perverse form of victory. So one answer to that that's universal in some sense is that you should establish a relationship with a transcendent value, because it never runs out of motivational power. So part of the utility of a transcendent value is that it never loses its motivational effectiveness. Now, you might say, well, that's no proof that there are transcendent values. It's like, yeah, that's true, but, there's more to the story. Okay, so when you're in one of these little stories, which is basically what they are, they're the simplest story. I was one place, I went by this means to another place. That's the simplest story. It's not that exciting. Much more exciting story is I was going from point A to B and something weird happened and then I didn't know where I was, and then I was like in chaos for 2 years, and then I figured out how to climb out of it. Everybody likes that story, right? That's a death and rebirth story, by the way, or a fall from paradise story with a regaining of paradise at the end. It's an archetypal story because everyone lives it. And so, anyways, when you're in one of these little stories, frames of reference, what you see in front of you are really things that one of the best scientists who ever studied visual perception the book's called Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. He called them affordances. An affordance is something that affords you something. And affordances can be positive or negative. I like to think about them as tools or obstacles. So for example, if I need to make a beeline for that door, you guys are all instantly obstacles. And the way I would respond to that, like implicitly, is that you'd all be negative. So imagine we just said fire. Well, you were people the minute before that, but the second after that, you're obstacles. And your emotional reactions to the people that are in front of you are going to reflect that. Now, you all know that because you drive, and once you're encapsulated in your little insectoid shell and don't have to deal with the immediate responses of other people, you're going to treat them like obstacles and like, demonic obstacles at the drop of a hat. And, that's pretty much automatic behavior. So tools are things that get you to where you want to go. And you remember, you know, human beings are tool-using animals par excellence, right? We're so tool-using that that's what we see. It's built right into us. We're always scanning the world for tools. When you look at gravel, for example, what you actually see are throwing-sized rocks. That's why they manifest themselves as that kind of object in the environment. You know, you're built at a certain level of resolution, and the way your nervous system parses up the world is into things that are useful for you and things that aren't. And those are not objects. The whole idea of object is a very, very modern derivative of that much more primordial system. And it's by no means clear at all that our notion of object is more real than the notion of affordance. In fact, as far as your brain is concerned, objects, no one cares about objects. What your brain cares about is affordances, and what your brain is adapted to is the world as a set of affordances and obstacles. And if you're a Darwinian, it's very difficult to escape the conclusion that what selected you is reality. And so if the reality that selected you shaped you so that what you see are affordances and obstacles, or you die, then it's perfectly real proposition, perfectly reasonable proposition to state that what reality is, in fact, is a set of affordances, tools, and obstacles. And that is how your brain works, by the way. And that's not a secondary derivation. I don't see the object and then think, this is how I would grip it. It's like that would take forever. You know, you'd never catch a baseball if that's what you were doing. It's like, oh, a round object is clunk. You know, it's like, that's just not going to work. Your nervous system is nowhere fast enough to do that consciously. You're using reptile circuitry to catch baseballs. The mammalian stuff is too damn slow. So you catch the ball often, especially if someone pitches it fast, before you can even see it. You just think you saw it. You see it after you caught it. It's the case with tennis players too. Okay, so basically the world lays itself out as tools and obstacles. And, you know, obstacles make you feel bad. But like, let's say I'm looking at this room and I'm thinking of you guys as obstacles. You might say, well, how bad does that make me feel? And the answer to that is, well, not very bad, because all I have to do is, you know, make a circuitous route and I can get to the door. So then the fact that you're obstacles is a very minor impediment to the execution of my plan. And as a consequence, it will produce a correspondingly low level of negative emotion. So, you can think of those as known unknowns. Known unknowns aren't that big a problem because you can plan for them, and you might have a plan that's an alternative plan that you could put in place in case they show up. What people really don't like are unknown unknowns. And unknown unknowns, you don't walk around those, man. They blow your whole map. And your map's quite complicated. It's actually hierarchical in structure. And I'll get to that. Because, you know, you go from point A to point B so that you can go to a bigger point A to point B. You know, you cross the road to get to the library, to study for an exam, to pass the exam, to get your degree, to get a job, to be a person, to be a citizen, to be a, you know, to have a good life. So then if someone gets in your way while you're crossing the road, then to some degree they're interfering with you getting a good life. Now, not very much, but sometimes you'll react like that. That certainly happens when you're dealing with an intimate partner, you know, because they'll make some little mistake and you'll say, you've always done that, you always do it, and you're always going to do it, which is really not a good way to conduct an argument. So, unknown unknowns. Well, unknown unknowns leap at you from places that you wouldn't expect. Because otherwise you would have planned for the damn things. So they're the things that are always like poking their beak up at you when you least expect it. And that's because you can't make a bounded area and keep the complexity out of it. The complexity always sneaks back in. Try protecting your children from the internet, for example. You can't make a bounded circumstance and get rid of all the complexity. It always comes sneaking back in. So what would be an unknown unknown? This is a good one. Here, you have an intimate relationship. You've had it for 10 years. You trust your partner. So what does that mean? You know where you are. You know who you are. And you have a pretty good idea of where you're going. And then one day you'll find out that your partner has been cheating on you, not with one person, but with 3 people. And for the whole 10 years. Well, hypothetically, that comes as a shock. Although you may have ignored many intimations that such might be the case. Irrelevant. Let's say it comes as a shock. Well, what happens to you? Well, you don't know where you are. You don't know where you've been. That's interesting, eh? Because you think You know where you've been because you've already been there, but all of a sudden something can happen so that you are so flipped over that you don't even know where you were. So that means in some sense the past is dependent on the present, a very peculiar thing. You also have no idea where you're going. In terms of not knowing where you are, that's deep, eh? Because you might think, well, I thought I was in a marriage. That turns out to be wrong. I thought I knew who my wife or husband was. That turns out to be wrong. I concluded on the basis that I knew my wife, that I knew something about women. That turned out to be wrong. I thought I was in a relationship with someone I could trust. That is wrong. I don't know enough about trust. I'm obviously too gullible. And so what that does is throw virtually everything that's ever happened to me in severe doubt, right? That's the emergence of chaos. Sometimes you're going from point A to point B, and something you don't expect manifests itself in the middle of your plan, but it's not such a catastrophe because you can just work around it. And then sometimes something pops up and like you just do not have a plan anymore. And so then you might ask yourself, just exactly where are you when you don't know where you are? And I would say that's a place. And it's actually a place that's well documented in classic religious and mythological stories. That's chaos. The Taoists, for example, they believe that the world is made out of chaos and order. Well, order, that's where you are when what you do gets you what you want. Chaos, that's where you are when you have no idea what's going on. And you might ask, well, is there a way that you should act when you're in chaos? And the answer to that is, there better be, because it's a place you're going to visit several times during your life. And everyone visits that. That's why it's an archetypal story. That's the descent to the underground. The underground is that horrible place that lurks underneath all of our presuppositions. It's the frigid lake underneath the thin ice that everybody's skating on. And it's something that can manifest itself at any moment. That's partly why in the Taoist symbol, the black paisley is chaos, by the way, and the white paisley is order. In the order paisley, there's a little black dot. Well, that's because order can turn into chaos, and does, at any moment. And the reverse is also true. Chaos can turn into order at any moment. An insight will do that for you. You know, alcoholics report that when they hit bottom. It's like there's a catalysis and they look at the world in a different way. You know, now they're a new person. They're back from the underground. They've risen from the dead, so to speak. You know, and it's partly because what looks like your right hemisphere is pretty good at inferring patterns in novel and chaotic places. It's kind of keeping track of things that happen to you that are anomalous. And it makes alternative maps of the world that are there for you to rely on, at least to some degree, if that ever becomes necessary. Now you might ask yourself, how upset should you be when something that you don't expect happens? Now it turns out that that is really a difficult question to answer. Because what the problem is that when something you don't expect happens, you don't know what it is. And so then you might say, well, how upset should you get? And the answer to that is, you don't know. And so what happens is, first of all, you've got some built-in approximators. One would be your genetically determined level of neuroticism, which is basically sensitivity to negative emotion. If you're more sensitive to negative emotion, you're going to manifest more psychophysiological preparation per unit of threat or uncertainty. Which is to say, some people get more upset about the same thing than other people do. Now, who's right? Well, who knows? You wake up in the morning and there's a little ache in your side. It's like, well, what is that? Is it sore muscle or cancer? You don't know. And if you're hypochondriacal, well, it's going to be cancer. And sometimes the hypochondriac is right. And so he's the one that lives when he goes to the emergency room and finds out exactly what's going on. So it's an unanswerable question. Now, the other way that your brain determines how upset you should be is by calculating your position in the dominance hierarchy. Because the higher you are in the dominance hierarchy, the more resources you have at your disposal, and so the less upset you have to get when anything horrible happens. So if you're barely clinging to the bottom of the social structure, you can be sure that your brain is going to estimate any anomalous occurrence as a catastrophe, which is why people don't like being at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, and it's also why people who are there die a lot sooner. And they die a lot sooner regardless of their absolute level of wealth. It's relative deprivation that counts.